Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Hope you have a relaxing and comfortable time with Stories for Happy Life channel. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Kentucky countryside, casting long golden rays across the rolling hills. The air shimmered with the last heat of the day, and the quiet, open road stretched far in both directions, barely traveled at this hour. It was the kind of road that invited stillness, where time seemed to move slower. Richard Calloway, a 78-year-old retired businessman, sat inside his deep navy blue Cadillac, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel with impatience. His car, an emblem of success from a life spent in high-stakes finance, gleamed under the sun. But right now, it was utterly useless. A flat tire had left him stranded miles away from town, and to his increasing frustration, his cell phone had no signal. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing at his dashboard. No service. He had spent the past 10 minutes trying to get a call through to roadside assistance, but the rural backroads of Kentucky weren't forgiving. Normally, Richard had an assistant or a driver handling issues like this. But today, he had been out on one of his rare, aimless drives, a habit he had developed in retirement when the walls of his luxurious estate felt too silent, too empty. With a sigh, he leaned back in his leather seat, resigned to waiting. He wasn't the type to panic, but the thought of sitting here for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon wasn't appealing. The road was quiet, almost eerily so. Then, in the distance, he noticed a figure approaching. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, was walking down the road, his steps steady, his posture relaxed. He was dressed in a faded t-shirt and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen better days. His jeans were worn at the knees, and his dark curls bounced slightly with each step. There was something confident about the way he moved, as if he had walked this road 100 times before. Richard sat up, watching as the boy neared. Most kids that age, he imagined, would have looked at his Cadillac with wide eyes, perhaps even circled it with curiosity. But this boy barely spared it a glance. Instead, his eyes flickered to the flat tire, and a knowing expression crossed his face. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked. His voice was steady, polite. Not timid, but not cocky either. Richard hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah. No signal on my phone either." The boy gave a small, thoughtful nod and took a step closer, examining the tire without hesitation. Richard watched as he crouched down, running his fingers lightly over the rubber, as if assessing the damage with experience. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer," the boy said. "If you've got a spare, I can fix it." Richard raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected an offer of help. "Are you sure?" he asked, glancing down the road. "I don't want to keep you from wherever you're headed." The boy shrugged. "I was just heading home from town. Ain't in no hurry." Still uncertain but with little choice, Richard gestured toward the trunk. The boy moved swiftly, opening it and pulling out the spare tire and tools with practiced ease. As he worked, Richard found himself watching with a strange sense of humility, an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. The boy didn't hesitate. His hands moved efficiently, unscrewing bolts, adjusting the jack, sliding the spare into place. He wasn't just guessing his way through the process. He knew exactly what he was doing. The quiet confidence in his movements intrigued Richard. For years, Richard had built his career around transactions, business deals, financial trades, power negotiations. In his world, nothing was ever done for free. There was always an exchange, a cost. And yet, here was a boy, dressed in worn-out clothes, clearly not from wealth, offering his time and effort without expecting anything in return. In less than 15 minutes, the boy straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "All done," he said with a satisfied nod. Richard blinked, looking at the now functional tire. That was fast. The boy just smiled, as if it was no big deal. Reaching into his wallet, Richard pulled out a few crisp bills, more than what a roadside service would have charged. "Here," he said, holding them out. I appreciate the help. But to his shock, the boy took a step back, raising a hand politely. No, thank you, sir, he said, just happy to help. Richard stared. People didn't turn down money, especially not kids. You sure? He asked. It's not much. The boy shook his head, offering a small, genuine smile. I don't need it. Then, without another word, he turned and continued walking down the road, as if nothing had happened. Richard watched him go, money still in his hand, a strange weight settling in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but the encounter had left him shaken in a way he hadn't expected. For years he had been surrounded by people who chased after wealth, who measured value in dollars and assets. Yet here was a boy who had just demonstrated a different kind of wealth, one built on selflessness, integrity, and an unwavering sense of dignity. As Richard started the engine, he checked his rearview mirror one last time. The boy's figure grew smaller in the distance, walking steadily toward whatever life awaited him. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Calloway felt something stir inside him. Something unfinished. Something that wouldn't let him forget. That night, Richard Calloway couldn't sleep. He sat in the dimly lit study of his sprawling estate, his whiskey glass resting untouched beside him. The air smelled of aged leather and polished wood, a scent that had once felt comforting. Now it felt hollow. The encounter with the boy Daniel kept replaying in his mind. Richard had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Business partners, employees, investors, they all measured their worth in wealth, just as he had. But this boy had been different. He had given his time, his effort, without expecting anything in return. Richard's world didn't work that way. There was always a price, a motive, a trade. So why had Daniel walked away? Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. Why was this bothering him so much? He had met thousands of people in his life. Powerful men, influential women, brilliant minds. Yet somehow, a kid in scuffed sneakers had left a deeper impression than any of them. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Something Richard couldn't quite name. All he knew was that he needed to find the boy again. The next morning, Richard wasn't in his usual tailored suit. Instead, he wore a simple polo shirt and jeans, casual but still unmistakably expensive. He slid into his navy blue Cadillac, the repaired tire rolling smoothly along the paved roads of his estate. His driver, Henry, stood by the garage, eyeing him curiously. "Sir, would you like me to?" "No," Richard interrupted. "I'll drive myself." Henry nodded, though his expression was mildly surprised. It had been years since Richard had driven himself anywhere outside of casual joyrides. Richard pulled out of his gated driveway and onto the open road. The same road where he had met Daniel the day before. He didn't know what he was going to say if he found him. He just knew he had to. He drove slowly, scanning the road. Nothing. After half an hour, he pulled into a gas station, stepping out of his car. The cashier, a woman in her 60s, looked up from her magazine. "Morning," Richard said, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for someone, a boy, about 13, maybe 14, curly hair, walked down this road yesterday." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You a cop?" Richard almost laughed. "No, just trying to find him." She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Don't know him, but you might want to check the diner down the road. Folks know everyone around here." Richard nodded. "Thanks." He drove to the small roadside diner, the kind with faded booths and checkered tile floors. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted him as he stepped inside. A waitress, middle-aged with tired eyes but a warm smile, approached him. "Seat for one?" "No," Richard said. "Actually, I'm looking for someone. A kid. Walks these roads. Helped me yesterday when I had a flat tire." The waitress's expression softened. "Sounds like you're talking about Daniel Whitaker." Richard's chest tightened at finally having a name. "He lives out in Harlan," she continued, wiping her hands on her apron. "Always helping folks around here. That's just the kind of kid he is." "Harlan?" Richard repeated, making a mental note. "It's about an hour that way," she said, pointing down the road. "Thanks," Richard said, leaving cash on the counter before heading out. The drive was scenic, rolling hills, dense forests, winding roads. But Richard barely noticed. He had questions. What kind of life had produced a boy like that? Who had raised him to be so selfless, so dignified despite having so little? And most of all, why did Richard feel so compelled to find him again? When he finally reached Harlan, the town was small and quiet. Modest homes, a few small businesses, people sitting on porches watching the world go by. Richard asked around, and soon someone pointed him to a small house at the edge of town. The house was worn but clean. The front porch sagged slightly under its own weight. A wooden fence ran along the yard, patched together in places with mismatched boards. Richard hesitated, standing in front of the door. What was he doing here? What was he even going to say? Before he could overthink it, he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. A woman, mid-40s, tired eyes but a kind face, stood there. She looked at Richard, taking in his expensive watch, his polished shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious but polite. Richard cleared his throat. "I believe I met your son yesterday," he said. "Daniel." The woman's expression softened instantly. "That sounds like my Daniel," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping folks." Richard nodded. "I just wanted to thank him properly." She looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his intentions. Then she stepped aside. "He's out back," she said. "You're welcome to wait." Richard stepped inside, taking in the modest surroundings. The furniture was old but well kept. The walls were adorned with family photos, and a few hand-drawn pictures, clearly from a much younger Daniel, were pinned to a corkboard. It was a far cry from Richard's pristine mansion, but there was something here that his home lacked. Warmth, life, a sense of family. For the first time, Richard realized just how empty his own house was. Following her into the backyard, he saw Daniel fixing the fence. When the boy looked up and saw him, his eyes widened in surprise. "Hey, mister," Daniel said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Richard smiled, feeling strangely nervous. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You helped me when I really needed it, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Daniel shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. It wasn't a big deal, but to Richard it was. For a moment, Richard and Daniel just stood there, the midday sun casting long shadows across the yard. Richard had spent his entire life making deals, closing contracts, and negotiating business partnerships. But now, standing in front of a 13-year-old boy with scraped-up sneakers and a quiet kind of wisdom, he found himself at a loss for words. How do you thank someone who doesn't want anything? Daniel leaned against the fence, arms crossed, his curiosity evident. "I don't think you realize what a big deal it was," Richard finally said, breaking the silence. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled. "I don't see it like that," he replied. "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" Richard let out a small breath of laughter, shaking his head. "You're a rare kind of person, Daniel." The boy smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. "So I've been told." Richard's eyes drifted to the house behind them. The fence Daniel had been fixing was held together with mismatched boards. The grass was uneven and dry. The old swing set in the backyard leaned slightly, its chains rusted. They didn't have much, that much was clear. But what struck Richard wasn't the poverty, it was the dignity. There was no bitterness in Daniel's tone, no self-pity, just pride in what they had, no matter how little. Richard turned to him. "I'd like to do something for you and your family." Daniel's smile faded slightly, his expression shifting into something more cautious. "We're okay, mister," he said. "We don't need anything." Richard had expected that answer, but he wasn't giving up so easily. "It's not about need," Richard insisted. "It's about what's right. You helped me, and I want to return the favor." Just then, Daniel's mother stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Daniel, you better come inside and wash up before lunch," she called. Then, her eyes shifted to Richard, studying him carefully. "Would you care to join us?" she asked, her voice kind but measured. "It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome." Richard hesitated. When was the last time someone invited him into their home, not because they wanted something, but simply because they had kindness to offer? "I'd like that," he said. Inside, the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. Richard sat down, feeling strangely out of place in his designer polo amidst the humble surroundings. Daniel washed his hands at the sink and joined them, his easy smile never faltering. As they ate, Richard found himself drawn into their conversation. Daniel talked about his school, his friends, his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother shared stories about the town and the people in it, speaking with a quiet pride about the community that looked out for each other. Richard listened, really listened, and felt something inside him shift. For all his wealth and success, his own home felt cold and empty compared to this one. There was laughter here. There was connection here. And for the first time in years, Richard realized just how alone he had been. As the meal wound down, Daniel's mother turned to Richard, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've done well for yourself, Mr. Calloway," she said, eyeing his expensive watch and tailored clothes. Richard gave a small laugh, shaking his head. "You know," he said, "I used to think success was about money, status, power, but none of it feels like this." She nodded, understanding. "It's not about what you have," she said softly. "It's about what you give." Richard fell silent. That was it. That was the lesson he had been searching for. As Richard stood to leave, he turned to Daniel. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "I want to do something for you and your mother." Daniel looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "We don't take charity," he said. Richard smiled. "This isn't charity, it's an investment." Daniel's eyebrows lifted in curiosity. "I see potential in you," Richard continued. "You're smart, hard-working, you have the kind of integrity that can't be bought." Daniel shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Okay," he said slowly. "So what exactly are you offering?" Richard gestured toward the house, the yard, the fence Daniel had been fixing with his own hands. "I'd like to help you fix up this place," he said. "Make sure you and your mother have everything you need." Daniel crossed his arms. "And in return?" Richard chuckled. "You sound like a businessman already." Daniel's mother, standing nearby, watched carefully. Richard turned to her. "I'll pay for the repairs, the renovations, but I'd also like to set up a fund for Daniel's future." Daniel's mother's eyes widened. "A fund? For his education," Richard clarified. "Engineering school, trade school, whatever he chooses." Silence filled the room. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mister," he said finally, "I don't know what to say." Richard smiled. "Then don't say anything. Just let me do this." After a long moment, Daniel nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But on one condition." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to help," Daniel said firmly. "If you're fixing up the house, I want to be part of it." Richard's chest tightened with admiration. "Deal." The next morning, Richard wasted no time. Sitting in his office, he picked up the phone and began making calls. A lot of them. Old colleagues, contractors, suppliers, and architects, people who owed him favors or simply respected his influence. Within a few hours, plans were in motion. By midday, a team of workers and trucks were headed toward the small house on the outskirts of town. Richard drove down himself, clipboard in hand, ready to oversee everything. When Richard pulled up to Daniel's house, he spotted the boy and his mother standing on the porch, staring in disbelief at the swarm of workers unloading supplies. Daniel's mother took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Calloway, what is all this?" Richard smiled warmly, stepping out of his car. "It's just a little help," he said. Daniel's eyes darted around, taking in the sight of lumber, fresh paint, and roofing materials being carried toward the house. His mother swallowed hard, her emotions visible on her face. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "We've managed fine on our own." Richard's expression softened. "You've done more than manage," he said. "You've thrived. But you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Let me give back." For the first time, Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he just nodded slowly, watching as workers measured wood planks and unloaded boxes of tools. Despite Richard's firm insistence that Daniel take it easy, the boy was determined to help. "I told you, mister," Daniel grinned, rolling up his sleeves. "If you're fixing my house, I'm working on it too." Richard laughed, shaking his head. "You're relentless." Over the next few days, Daniel watched the workers closely, learning from them. A burly contractor named Joe noticed the boy's keen interest and called him over. "You want to learn how to use this?" Joe asked, holding up a tape measure and a level. Daniel's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." And just like that, Daniel was part of the crew. He measured wood planks, helped sand down beams, and even assisted in nailing the first few boards into place. The workers, at first amused, quickly took a liking to him. "He's got a good head on his shoulders," Joe told Richard one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "Kid's got potential." Richard, watching from the porch, felt something stir inside him. He'd spent years mentoring young executives, training businessmen, building companies. But now, watching Daniel learn something with his hands, he realized this felt different. Within weeks, the house began to take on a whole new life. The old sagging porch was replaced with sturdy wood. The roof was repaired, keeping them safe from leaks. The kitchen, once outdated and small, was upgraded with modern appliances. The rusty swing set in the backyard was replaced with a new one. Everywhere, neighbors gathered to watch the transformation, some even bringing over fresh baked bread and coffee for the workers. One afternoon, as Daniel stood admiring the fresh coat of paint on his home, Richard walked over, hands in his pockets. "So," Richard said, nodding toward the house. "What do you think?" Daniel took a deep breath, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I think." He hesitated, then turned to Richard with a small, grateful smile. "I think it's finally a home." Richard felt his throat tighten, something deep and unexpected welling up inside him. He reached out, placing a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You deserve this," he said simply. Daniel just nodded, the weight of it all settling in. That night, Richard sat alone in his mansion, sipping a glass of scotch. His house was perfect. Gleaming floors, expensive artwork, luxury furniture. But it felt empty. He thought about Daniel's house, not as grand, not as polished, but filled with warmth, with laughter, with family. For the first time, Richard realized he had spent his life chasing wealth, but he had never truly built a home. And maybe, just maybe, Daniel and his mother had given him something far more valuable than he had given them. The renovations were complete. The house, once worn and weathered, now stood strong and full of life. The once sagging porch was now sturdy and inviting. The kitchen, once a cramped space with outdated appliances, now gleamed with new countertops and cabinets. Daniel's room, which had been small and cold, now had freshly painted walls, a solid desk, and a real bed that didn't squeak with every movement. But more than the physical changes, something else had shifted. For the first time, Daniel and his mother didn't have to just make do. They could breathe. The final day of the renovations felt like a community celebration. Neighbors stopped by, bringing homemade jam, warm loaves of bread, and even a potted plant for the front porch. Daniel ran around excitedly, showing his friends the new swing set in the backyard. His mother, who had always carried the weight of their struggles alone, laughed with ease as she chatted with Richard. For once, there was no struggle, just joy. Richard stood on the porch railing, watching it all unfold. A life he had never known, but suddenly one he couldn't imagine living without. Beside him, Daniel's mother handed him a glass of iced tea. "You've done more than fix a house," she said softly. "You've given us hope." Richard nodded, taking a sip, letting the weight of her words settle in his chest. "I think," he admitted, "I found something for myself too." That evening, as the sky turned from gold to deep orange, Daniel sat beside Richard on the porch. The boy was quieter than usual, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden railing. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. "Mr. Calloway." Richard turned, sensing something important was coming. "I've been thinking about what you did for us." He glanced toward the house, his voice thoughtful. "I want to do something like that one day." Richard's brows raised. "You mean construction?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I mean helping people." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You built businesses, right?" Richard nodded. "I want to do that," Daniel continued, his voice full of quiet determination. "I want to build something that helps people like my mom, people who work hard but never seem to catch a break." Richard felt a chill, not from the wind, but from the sheer depth of the boy's resolve. Here was a 13-year-old kid standing on the edge of his future, already thinking beyond himself, already thinking about impact. For the first time in a long time, Richard saw himself, but a better version of himself. Richard placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You already are helping people, Daniel," he said. The boy's head tilted in confusion. Richard smiled. "Your kindness set all of this in motion. None of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help a stranger on the side of the road." Daniel blinked, processing the weight of those words. For the first time, he realized it was true. One moment of kindness had started a chain reaction, one that had changed his home, his family, and even the life of the wealthy stranger he had helped. Richard sat back, gazing at the horizon. "You want to build something?" he asked. Daniel nodded firmly. "Then let me teach you how." The weeks that followed brought more than just a renovated home. Daniel started shadowing the workers who had built his house, learning more about construction and design. Richard introduced him to business concepts, showing him how to turn ideas into reality. Richard returned to Harlan more often, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. For the first time in decades, he wasn't chasing deals, numbers, or status. He was chasing purpose. And Daniel? Daniel was chasing a future far bigger than he had ever imagined possible. One that didn't just change his life, but the lives of countless others. Many months later, Richard sat in his office, not in his mansion, but in a small, cozy workspace he had rented in Harlan. Daniel sat across from him, flipping through business books Richard had given him. The boy had come a long way. He wasn't just learning construction, he was learning leadership. He wasn't just fixing houses, he was thinking about building a better future for his community. And Richard? For the first time in his life, he realized something profound. It had never been about the wealth. It had always been about what you did with it, about who you helped with it. And somehow, a 13-year-old kid had reminded him of that truth. As Daniel packed up his books for the day, he turned to Richard and grinned. "Mr. Calloway, I think I might build something pretty great one day." Richard chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "I don't think, Daniel," he said. "I know you will." Because kindness had built this moment, and kindness would build his future. What is lesson here? 1. Kindness needs no reward. True kindness isn't about what you get in return. It's about doing the right thing simply because you can. The young boy helped the stranded millionaire without expecting anything, showing that selfless actions often lead to unexpected blessings. 2. Wealth isn't measured in money. Despite having little in material wealth, the boy and his mother lived with integrity, gratitude, and generosity. The story reminds us that wealth isn't just about financial success, it's about the values, love, and kindness that shape our lives. Number 3. Giving back creates lasting impact. The millionaire learned that helping others isn't just about charity, it's about recognizing potential and investing in people. When we uplift those who have helped us, we create opportunities that can change lives forever. 4. The smallest actions can inspire change. One act of kindness can have a ripple effect far beyond what we imagine. A simple act, changing a tire, transformed both the boy's future and the millionaire's perspective on life, proving that even the smallest gestures can lead to something greater. Number 5. Success is built on character, not circumstances. The young boy's work ethic, humility, and willingness to help others prove that success isn't about where you come from, it's about who you choose to be. His character made all the difference, inspiring the millionaire to take action and make a change. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, kindness and integrity will always be worth more than money.